So I've been talking about this guy, Gim Dean, a philosopher from South Vietnam who wrote a lot in the 1960s and 70s. I've been talking about him as if I thought this guy is just a fantastic person and a great scholar. And in a lot of ways, this was a very intelligent person. However, over the course of the 60s and into the 1970s, his ideas went in a direction that ultimately was unsound. And as a result, he produced a massive body of work which is incredibly problematic. To boil it all down to an essence, essentially what Gim Dean came to argue was that there were two main groups of peoples, or cultures, we could say, or cultural worlds in Asia in the past. One was from an area that essentially went from the Yangtze River down to Vietnam, and the other was from the area to the north of there. The culture of the people that we today refer to as the Chinese and Chinese culture. What Gim Dean argued, however, was that before the Chinese world became dominant, it was this Viet world south of the Yangtze that was dominant, and that many of the things that today are an essential component of the thing we see as Chinese culture ultimately emerged first in this Viet world. And he came up with this term Viet Nha. In Chinese it would be Yue Ru, which can mean Viet scholar or even Viet Confucian, as a way to point to this idea that it was among the Viet world that the ideas that ultimately became part of the scholarly Confucian tradition emerged. So how did he get these ideas? Where is the evidence to support it? Well, there isn't really evidence to support this, at least not textual evidence. And as a result, to make his points, Gim Dean had to turn to some other technique. And in the 1960s, when he was writing, anthropology was, in the field of anthropology, there was a school of thought or an approach known as structuralism that was becoming very popular. And what Gim Dean did essentially was to take a structural approach toward the early history of East Asia and to make his argument based on a structural interpretation of the early history of the region. So what is structuralism and how does this work? Essentially, what anthropologists realized is that history is essential for understanding people. If you don't understand their past, where they came from, how they got to the places where they were, it's difficult to understand the people in the present. Well, what do you do when you're an anthropologist and you're studying some people that has never learned to write, that doesn't have a written record, and doesn't have recorded history? They just have maybe oral stories that date from who knows when and are therefore very difficult to use as historical sources. Well, what structuralism did was it gave a means to provide a kind of history for people who didn't have history. What people like Claude Lévi-Strauss, the main proponent of structuralism, argued was that, okay, if you have an oral story, we can't tell when exactly it was created and we can't verify the information in it. However, what we can do is look at the kind of underlying structure of ideas that upholds it. And he said, in particular, if you look at stories, you find binary oppositions in it. Man, woman, good, bad, land, water, human, animal, things like this. And if we look at these kind of binaries and how they maybe get resolved in a community or in a story, we can gain at least some cultural sense of who these people are. It's not really history, but it's something that we can kind of pull out from the bits and pieces of information that we have. Claude Lévi-Strauss was willing to do this with oral stories, what Gim Dean essentially did was to take the bits and pieces of textual information that remain from the past and to try to do the same thing, to try to find some kind of underlying logic or some web of connections that these texts ultimately hid, but if you knew how to read through the bits and pieces that were there, you could see this underlying world of ideas and values that existed there. Let's see an example of this. In the 15th century, there were some accounts written in Vietnam, or the Red River Delta at that time, which refer to an early figure in the political history of the region by the name of Lac Long Quan. This person does not exist in any sources before this time. And it would be obvious to think that this is a creation of that period, but from the perspective of Gim Dean, he sees this as an actual figure that existed in the past. Again, we might not be able to know too much about him for sure, but one thing that's important about him is in his name he has the character Laum, which means long in Chinese, which is dragon, and from that he assumes that serpents, dragons, something about that is important for these early Viet peoples. He then looks, however, at the character that was used to refer to the early residents of the early inhabitants of the Red River Delta. In history written by a Chinese historian, Sima Qian, roughly 1,000 years ago, he refers to the people who lived in the Red River Delta as Lac. That's the name that he used. And in this character, there's a component that literally means horse. The other part represents sound, which is where you get the lac, but the other part has some kind of meaning, and it's used, and there's a horse component that's used there. In the 15th century, when people in the Red River Delta recorded what was theoretically the same name, they used a different character, and the component that they used for sound was the same, but the component that they used for meaning meant something like an insect, a legless insect. And from this, what Gim Dean said, what did was to try to explain, using essentially a structural approach to explaining things, why these two characters separated in time by about 1,500 years would still be interconnected. What he said was that Sima Qian included the horse component to the character because following the I Ching, there's a passage there, according to Gim Dean, where something like Dan Ma, Bin Ma, a kind of horse, is connected to the character Kun, which is associated with the south, whereas Long Fei Zai Tian, flying dragon in heaven, is associated with the character for Qian, which is also associated with the north, and therefore the reason why Sima Qian wrote the character Lac and included a horse component or radical to it was because he associated the horse with the south. The Lac people lived in the south, and therefore the character that he created had meaning at that time. Meanwhile, in the 15th century, Ngo Si Lien was the inheritor of this long collective consciousness of the Viet people who saw themselves as somehow associated with a dragon serpent world, and he therefore wrote the character lac with this component or radical that represented a kind of legless insect, not unlike a serpent, so that the people who read it would be remembered of their association with the kind of serpent dragon world. So therefore, this is an example of the kind of ways that Gim Dean looked at the past. You've got these just bits and pieces of information, two characters that theoretically refer to the same people and are written differently, and to explain these, the reason why they're written differently, Gim Dean refers to a kind of this sort of subtextual structure of meaning that's there and that persists throughout time, and that we can understand if we know how to interpret it correctly. And that's where things get interesting. What's interesting is, how do we know how to interpret this stuff correctly? One of the biggest problems with the structural approach to anthropology, or structural anthropology as people later discovered, was that there's really no way to verify the explanations that people give forth. If you say that to the ancient Viet there was this importance of dragons, well, you've got to show that somehow. Or if you say that there's these certain binaries that were there, you need to demonstrate this. And many of these things cannot be demonstrated. In the case of the example I just gave, we would need to demonstrate somehow that Sima Qian created specific characters for specific peoples with these kind of deep ideas in his mind, in which he created a new character with the intent of giving that character a lot of deep meaning. So in the case of the character lac, he wanted to refer to a people, but also to their location. Do we have any evidence that he actually did this? No, we do not. How could you provide evidence? Well, the way you could do it is if we did have evidence for other cases where Sima Qian created characters where we know he created something new for a specific purpose. Then we could say that he did the same thing, perhaps for these people who lived in the Red River Delta. But Gim Dean has no evidence for this. He's just assuming that this is something that could happen, and that did happen. The same thing as with Ngo Si Lien. We also have no evidence that he created characters to give them new meanings. If we did have examples of this, then we would have something that we could use to verify that perhaps this is something possible. But this explanation that Gim Dean put forward is simply unverifiable. And therefore, it's a very weak argument to make, because it's outside of the mind of the person who created it. There's no evidence for any of these things that this person claimed. And so this is one example of many, many, many other ideas that Gim Dean came up with. They're fascinating in that we can see that this guy was fascinated with the promise at the time of structural anthropology and its way to explain phenomena for which there just isn't enough information. But as we now know, you can't really explain things if you don't have information to support it. And there are various ways to do it, such as, like I just said, if you have examples of ABC, then you can maybe propose that D is following the same pattern. But Gim Dean did not have examples like this. It was in his head. He created these things and created essentially an entire mythology about the early history of Asia and the Red River Delta. Texture, point one.